A millionaire left his pregnant wife for a younger woman. What she did with their child left him shaking. And before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Enjoy the story. The echo of James's polished leather shoes against the marble floors of their mansion was the last sound Isabella would hear from him that morning. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching as he walked toward the front door, his crisp suit perfectly tailored, his phone already in hand, as if the life they'd built together was no more than a task on his to-do list. When the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, the silence that followed was deafening. Isabella's gaze fell to the letter he had left behind on the gleaming console table, its crisp white envelope a stark contrast to the ornate gold of their decor. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her chest tightening with each word she read. Isabella, this isn't the life I want anymore. I need my freedom. I've left you enough to get by, but I can't be the man you need me to be. You'll be fine. Take care of yourself. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to keep reading, as if some part of the letter might hold an explanation that made sense. But there was none. No apology, no acknowledgement of the child growing inside her, just a cold dismissal of the life they had shared. For 6 years, Isabella had stood by James through every triumph and setback. She had been the quiet support behind his extravagant lifestyle, the one who smiled at charity galas and endured long nights alone while he entertained business partners and acquaintances. She had been his wife, his confidant, his partner. And now, she was nothing. Her knees buckled as she sank onto the velvet bench in the foyer, her hands gripping the edge of the letter as if it might anchor her to the ground. The weight of his abandonment pressed down on her, suffocating and unrelenting. Her free hand instinctively moved to her growing belly, a silent reassurance to the life within her that she was still there. For hours, Isabella sat in that cold, opulent space, staring blankly at the world outside the grand windows. The sun moved across the sky, casting shifting shadows across the room, but she didn't move. Her mind replayed every moment of their life together, searching for the signs she had missed, the moments that might have warned her of what was to come. And then, as the shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the sky, something inside her shifted. The tears stopped, replaced by a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Anger. Not the fiery, destructive kind, but a quiet, smoldering rage that ignited a spark deep within her. James had left her. He had chosen his freedom, his desires, over their family. But what he didn't realize, what he had underestimated, was her strength. He believed she would crumble without him, that she would be nothing more than a shadow of the life he had walked away from. But he was wrong. Isabella stood, her legs shaky but determined. She crumpled the letter in her hand and tossed it into the nearest trash bin, as if discarding the remnants of her old life. "You may have left us, James," she whispered to the empty room, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, "but you won't define us." The next morning, Isabella began the process of unraveling the life she had built around James. She contacted a real estate agent to put the mansion on the market. Every room, every piece of furniture, was a reminder of the man who had betrayed her trust. She packed what little was truly hers, family heirlooms, photographs of her parents, the baby clothes she had quietly collected over the past few months, and left the rest behind. Her destination was a modest apartment in the city, a far cry from the sprawling estate she had called home. The walls were bare, the furniture secondhand, but as she unpacked her belongings, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Control. This space, humble as it was hers. No one could take it away. Isabella's first days in her new life were filled with uncertainty. She spent hours poring over job listings, her hand resting protectively on her belly as she tried to envision a future for herself and her child. Her savings from James's parting gift were enough to cover a few months' rent, but she knew she couldn't rely on it for long. She thought back to the charity events she had organized as James's wife, her ability to manage logistics and connect with people. Perhaps those skills could translate into a career. But the world outside James's influence was unkind. Employers hesitated when they saw her pregnancy, their polite smiles masking their judgment. Every rejection stung, but Isabella refused to let it break her. Late at night, as the city lights flickered outside her window, Isabella would sit with her hands resting on her belly, whispering to her child. "We'll be okay," she would say, her voice steady even as her heart ached with doubt. "I'll make sure of it. You'll see." By the end of the first week, Isabella had mapped out a plan. She would rebuild her life, one small step at a time. She didn't know how long it would take, but she knew she couldn't fail. Her child was counting on her, and she would move heaven and earth to give them the life they deserved. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling of her new apartment, Isabella felt the first flicker of hope. James had left her, but he hadn't destroyed her. If anything, his absence had given her the clarity she needed to see her own strength. And that strength would carry her forward, no matter how uncertain the road ahead might be. Isabella's new apartment was small, but to her, it felt like a blank slate. The bare walls and creaky floors held none of the heavy memories that had haunted her in the mansion. She spent her first evening unpacking, her hands moving mechanically as she tried to adjust to the quiet. Without the echo of servants' footsteps or the distant hum of James's meetings, the silence was almost deafening. Yet it was her silence now, and that made it bearable. The next morning, Isabella woke with a purpose. She stood in front of the mirror, looking at the woman staring back at her. Her once glossy hair was tied in a messy bun, her face pale from sleepless nights. She barely recognized herself, but she straightened her shoulders and whispered, "This isn't the end. It's the beginning." Her first task was survival. James's parting money was enough for a few months' expenses, but she was determined not to let it last any longer than necessary. That money felt tainted, a reminder of his pity rather than his responsibility. Isabella needed her own income, something she could call hers. She pulled out her laptop and began searching for jobs. Marketing, event planning, administrative work, anything she could use to support herself and the baby. But as the days turned into weeks, the rejections piled up. Interviews ended with sympathetic smiles and phrases like, "We're looking for someone with more availability," or "It might be difficult to balance the demands of this role with your situation." Isabella's growing belly was more visible now, and while she saw it as a symbol of strength, the world seemed to view it as a liability. The strain of constant rejection began to wear on her. Each evening, she would return to her apartment, collapsing onto the couch and running her hands over her stomach. "I'm trying," she would whisper to the baby. "I promise I'm trying." One night, as Isabella sat scrolling through yet another page of job postings, she came across an opening at a small marketing agency. It was an entry-level position, far beneath her skill set, but she sent her application anyway. The next day, to her surprise, she received a call for an interview. The manager, a no-nonsense woman named Claire, seemed skeptical at first, her eyes flicking to Isabella's belly more than once during the conversation. But as Isabella spoke about her past experience coordinating high-profile charity events, Claire's skepticism gave way to curiosity. "I'm going to be honest," Claire said, leaning back in her chair. "This job isn't glamorous. It's a lot of grunt work, and the pay isn't great. But if you're willing to put in the effort, there's room to grow." Isabella met her gaze, her voice steady. "I'm not looking for glamour. I'm looking for an opportunity." Claire nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "All right, you start Monday." The relief that washed over Isabella was overwhelming. It wasn't just a job. It was a lifeline. On her first day, she arrived early, dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, her heart pounding as she walked through the agency's doors. The office was modest, a far cry from the luxurious venues she had once organized events in, but it was alive with energy. Phones rang, keyboards clacked, and ideas flew back and forth between the staff. Isabella threw herself into the work. She stayed late, taking on tasks no one else wanted and asking questions whenever she didn't understand something. The job was challenging, but she thrived on the structure it provided. Each completed project was a small victory, a reminder that she was capable of standing on her own. As weeks turned into months, Isabella began to climb the ranks. Claire took notice of her dedication and started assigning her more significant responsibilities. Isabella's creativity and attention to detail quickly made her an asset to the team. Her first big campaign, a rebranding project for a local business, was a success, and the client's praise solidified her reputation as someone who could deliver results. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. Balancing her demanding job with the physical toll of pregnancy was exhausting. There were nights when she would come home and cry from sheer fatigue, her body aching as she tried to prepare dinner or finish a project. Yet every time she felt like giving up, a small kick from her baby reminded her of why she was fighting so hard. Her pregnancy became a source of quiet strength. As her belly grew, so did her determination. She began to see herself not as someone who had been abandoned, but as someone who was rebuilding, brick by brick. Each paycheck, each completed project, was another step toward the future she was creating for herself and her child. The people around her began to notice her transformation. Colleagues who had initially underestimated her started to seek her advice. Even Claire, who rarely handed out compliments, told her one day, "You're tougher than you look, Isabella." One evening, as Isabella sat at her small dining table with a cup of tea, she opened her laptop to review her finances. The apartment's rent was covered, her bills were paid, and she had even managed to start a small savings account. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of stability. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She glanced at the stack of baby clothes she had folded earlier, a smile tugging at her lips. Her baby hadn't even been born yet, but they had already become her greatest motivator. "We're doing it," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "We're going to be okay." As Isabella prepared for bed that night, she thought about how far she had come. The woman who had crumbled on the mansion floor months ago felt like a stranger now. She had found strength in her vulnerability, turning her pain into purpose. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't let James's choices define her. This was her life now, and she was determined to make it a good one. The day Ethan was born, the world around Isabella seemed to pause. It was a crisp spring morning, and the air in the small, bustling city hospital was filled with the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the hushed urgency of nurses. But to Isabella, the only sound that mattered was the first sharp cry of her baby. Tears streamed down her face as she held him for the first time, his tiny hand gripping her finger as if to reassure her that they were in this together. She named him Ethan, a name she had whispered to herself during countless sleepless nights. Looking into his wide, curious eyes, she felt a kind of love she hadn't thought possible. It wasn't just love, it was purpose, the kind of unwavering determination that could weather any storm. "It's just us now, Ethan," she murmured, her voice trembling. "But we're going to be okay. I promise." The first few weeks were a whirlwind of exhaustion and learning. Her once organized life was now dictated by Ethan's needs. Feedings at all hours, diaper changes, and the endless cycle of soothing a newborn. There were nights when Isabella sat rocking him in the dim light of their small apartment, her body aching with fatigue, yet she found herself smiling as she watched him drift off to sleep. He was her everything, and the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. But motherhood wasn't without its challenges. Balancing a newborn and her job at the marketing agency was a feat that that required every ounce of her strength. Isabella returned to work just 6 weeks after giving birth, determined to keep the job that had become their lifeline. Each morning, she kissed Ethan goodbye, leaving him in the care of a kind elderly neighbor named Mrs. Caldwell, whose warmth reminded Isabella of her own late mother. At the office, Isabella worked tirelessly, often juggling deadlines with the nagging guilt of being away from Ethan. Her colleagues admired her resilience, but rarely saw the nights she spent crying quietly over her laptop, wondering if she was doing enough. Yet, every time she walked through the door and saw Ethan's face light up, her doubts melted away. His laughter became her fuel, his milestones her victories. By the time Ethan turned 2, Isabella had climbed the ranks at the agency. Her boss, Claire, had taken notice of her innovative ideas and steady work ethic, assigning her larger campaigns and giving her the recognition she had fought so hard to earn. Isabella's life was far from perfect, but it was hers. She had built it with her own 2 hands, and she was proud of the home she had created for Ethan. As Ethan grew, his personality began to shine through. He was curious, creative, and incredibly observant for his age. At 4 years old, he was already asking questions about how things worked, taking apart toys to see what was inside. Isabella encouraged his curiosity, filling their shelves with books and puzzles, nurturing his natural intelligence. One evening, as they sat together building a block tower, Ethan asked a question that made Isabella's breath catch. "Mommy, why don't I have a dad?" The simplicity of the question hit her like a wave. She had always known this moment would come, but she hadn't prepared herself for how much it would hurt. She paused, her hands stilling on the blocks, and forced a smile. "Every family's different, sweetheart," she said gently. "It's just been you and me from the start, and we've done pretty well, haven't we?" Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied for now, but Isabella knew the question would come again. As she tucked him into bed that night, she sat by his side, stroking his hair as he drifted off to sleep. "You're all I'll ever need," she whispered. But deep down, a part of her wondered if Ethan would ever truly be content with her answer. Life continued, and Ethan flourished. By the time he started school, his teachers were already calling him gifted. He excelled in math and science, often coming home with ribbons and certificates that Isabella proudly displayed on their refrigerator. She poured every spare penny into opportunities for him, enrichment programs, science kits, and books, determined to give him the tools to reach his full potential. But with every achievement, Isabella couldn't help but feel the weight of what Ethan was missing. She had become both mother and father to him, yet there were moments. Father-son events at school, sports games where other dads cheered from the sidelines, that reminded her of the void James had left. One day, while sorting through some old boxes, Isabella came across a photo of her and James from their wedding day. For a moment, she allowed herself to linger on the memory, the way they had once looked at each other with so much hope and love. She had long since stopped feeling anger toward him. Instead, she felt a quiet sadness for what could have been. She tucked the photo away, unwilling to let it taint the life she had built for Ethan. James had made his choice, and she had made hers. And as far as she was concerned, Ethan didn't need anyone but her. Yet, fate had a way of rewriting the stories we thought were already told. Isabella had no way of knowing that their carefully constructed world was on a collision course with the past. And when the past came knocking, it would force her to confront the life she thought she had left behind. It was a rare, sunny Saturday morning when Isabella and Ethan ventured to the city's annual science fair. For weeks, Ethan had been preparing his project, a solar-powered car he had designed using scraps from old electronics Isabella had collected. The fair was a bustling scene, filled with children proudly explaining their projects and parents snapping photos at every corner. For Isabella, it was a moment of pride. Ethan, now 7 years old, was one of the youngest participants in the fair, but his confidence and passion made him stand out. Ethan's booth was decorated with hand-drawn diagrams and a neatly labeled model of his car. As he explained the mechanics to a small crowd of curious onlookers, Isabella stood off to the side, her heart swelling with pride. She watched as he confidently answered questions, his green eyes, so much like James's, lighting up with excitement. "Mom, they love it," Ethan called out to her, his voice brimming with joy. "I told you they would," she replied with a warm smile, giving him a thumbs up. Isabella was about to step closer when a voice behind her froze her in place. "Impressive kid. He must have gotten that from you." Her heart stopped. The voice was unmistakable, smooth, with just a hint of arrogance, a tone she hadn't heard in years. Slowly, she turned, and there he was, James. He stood a few feet away, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place amidst the casual crowd. His hair was slightly grayer at the temples, his face lined with the faintest signs of age, but he was still the same man who had walked out of her life all those years ago. For a moment, she couldn't speak, the memories rushing back like a wave threatening to pull her under. James's eyes flicked past her, landing on Ethan, who was now demonstrating his project to a group of judges. The realization hit him slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more profound, something that resembled guilt. "That's him, isn't it?" he asked, his voice quiet. "That's my son." Isabella's chest tightened. She stepped forward, her voice sharp and low. "You don't get to call him that. You don't get to be that." James hesitated, his usual air of confidence replaced with something softer. "I didn't know, Isabella. If I had—" "Don't," she interrupted, her tone trembling with anger. "You didn't want to know. You left without a second thought, and now you think you can just waltz back in? No, it doesn't work like that." James's gaze remained fixed on Ethan, a mixture of awe and regret in his eyes. "He's amazing," he said softly. "Look at him. He's brilliant." Isabella felt a surge of protectiveness rise in her chest. "He is," she said firmly. "And he got there without you." James turned back to her, his expression earnest. "I made a mistake, Isabella. I was selfish, and I've regretted it every day since. Please, let me—" "Let you what?" she snapped. "Make yourself feel better. Prove to yourself that you're not a complete failure of a human being. You don't get to use Ethan for that." Her voice cracked slightly, but she held her ground. "He doesn't know you exist, James. He doesn't need to know. I've protected him from the kind of pain you're capable of causing, and I won't let you hurt him." James opened his mouth to respond, but a cheer from the crowd cut him off. They both turned to see Ethan holding up a small ribbon, his face glowing with pride. He waved at Isabella, who forced a smile and waved back, her heart heavy with the weight of the encounter. As Ethan ran over to her, clutching his award, Isabella knelt down to meet him. "I'm so proud of you," she said, wrapping him in a tight hug. "Thanks, Mom." Ethan beamed, completely oblivious to the tension in the air. James watched from a distance, his hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to say something, to reach out, but he knew this wasn't his moment. Isabella's words echoed in his mind, each one hitting harder than the last. He had walked away from this. He had chosen a life without them. And now, the magnitude of what he had lost was staring him in the face. As Isabella guided Ethan away from the booth, she cast one last glance at James. Her expression was a mixture of defiance and pain, a silent warning that she wouldn't let him disrupt their lives. James stood rooted to the spot, watching them disappear into the crowd, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't even begin to name. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to manipulate outcomes to his advantage. But now, for the first time, he felt powerless. The boy he had abandoned was thriving without him, and the woman he had left behind had become stronger than he ever could have imagined. As he walked away from the science fair, James made a silent vow to himself. This wasn't over. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to be part of Ethan's life. For once, he would fight for something that truly mattered. Meanwhile, Isabella and Ethan return home, the ribbon now proudly displayed on their refrigerator. Ethan chattered excitedly about his next project, completely unaware of the storm brewing in his mother's heart. That night, as Isabella tucked Ethan into bed, she kissed his forehead and whispered, "I'll always protect you." But as she sat alone in the quiet of their apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully built world was on the brink of change, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. James hadn't been able to stop thinking about Ethan since the science fair. Every detail was burned into his mind. The boy's confident stance, the way he spoke about his project with such enthusiasm, the brightness in his eyes that reminded James so much of himself. He had expected to feel guilt, maybe regret, but he hadn't anticipated the overwhelming sense of loss that had settled deep in his chest. For years, he had convinced himself that leaving was the right decision, that Isabella would move on, that she and the child he had abandoned would be better off without him. He had built his life around that belief, throwing himself into business, wealth, and relationships that never lasted. But seeing Ethan shattered that illusion. The life he had walked away from hadn't crumbled without him. It had flourished. Sitting in his sleek, modern office high above the city, James found himself staring blankly at the reports on his desk. His assistant knocked, bringing in a fresh cup of coffee and a reminder of his upcoming meeting, but he barely heard her. All he could think about was the look in Isabella's eyes when she had told him that Ethan didn't know he existed, that he had no place in their lives. That was a reality James refused to accept. That night, he did something he had never done before. He searched for Isabella online. Her name, once tied only to him as his wife, now carried weight of its own. She was no longer just Isabella Crawford, the woman who stood beside a millionaire. She was Isabella Reynolds, creative director at Pierce and Madden Marketing Agency. James clicked through articles and press releases detailing her rise in the industry. She had built something for herself, something he had never believed she could do without his money, without his influence. And she had done it all while raising their son, his son. The words felt foreign, yet undeniable. Ethan was his. He had always been. And James had done nothing but ignore that truth. Driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, James called an old acquaintance, a private investigator he had used for business matters before. "I need information on someone," he said, his voice firm. Discreetly, within 2 days, a neatly compiled file landed on James's desk. Photos of Ethan at school, reports on his academic achievements, clippings from local news outlets that had featured his projects. But the most gut-wrenching part was the sheer lack of anything that hinted at James's existence in the boy's life. Ethan had grown up without a father, and he seemed perfectly fine without one. James felt his stomach twist. He had told himself for years that leaving had been a necessary decision, that he had been freeing both himself and Isabella from a life that wouldn't have worked. But now, staring at pictures of the child he had never met, he saw the truth for what it was. He had been a coward. That night, he wrote Isabella a letter. He had considered calling, even showing up at her office, but he knew she wouldn't listen. This needed to be different. "Isabella, I know I have no right to ask for anything after what I did, and I know the last thing you want is to hear from me. But I saw Ethan. I saw what an incredible boy he is, and I can't ignore what that means. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to let me in, but I need to try. I need to be a part of his life, in whatever way you'll allow. I'll respect your boundaries. I won't do anything you don't approve of. But please, let me try to fix what I broke, James." He hesitated before sealing the envelope, then decided against sending it to her home. He wouldn't risk confusing Ethan or making Isabella feel ambushed. Instead, he had the letter delivered to her office. 2 days later, Isabella sat at her desk, staring at the unopened envelope. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her heart pounded as she traced her fingers over the seal, debating whether to open it or throw it straight into the trash. She had spent years erasing James from her life, years building a world where his absence wasn't a wound, but a fact. Now, with just one letter, he was threatening to unravel everything she had worked so hard to protect. Taking a deep breath, she unfolded the paper and read. By the time she reached the last sentence, her hands were trembling. She wanted to scream, to tear the letter apart and pretend it had never arrived. But she couldn't deny the truth in his words. James was Ethan's father. And though she had done everything in her power to fill that void, could she really keep Ethan from the man who had given him half of his existence? That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Isabella sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the letter. The past was clawing its way back into her life, demanding to be acknowledged. She had fought so hard to move forward. Letting James back in, even in the smallest way, felt like a risk she wasn't sure she was willing to take. But then she thought about Ethan, about the questions he had started asking, about the look on his face when he saw other children with their fathers. She sighed, rubbing her temples. James had no right to demand anything. But maybe, just maybe, she had to give Ethan the choice she had never planned to offer. Pulling out a piece of paper, she began to write. James, this isn't about you. This is about Ethan. I don't know what you expect from this, but I will not let you disrupt his life. If you truly want to be part of his world, you'll have to earn it. We'll meet, but on my terms. Isabella. She sealed the envelope, knowing that this was the beginning of something she couldn't control. James had walked away once, but now, whether she liked it or not, he was back. And this time, everything was about to change. The envelope with Isabella's reply rested on James's polished desk, untouched for hours. He had picked it up the moment it was delivered to his office, but the weight of what it could contain had kept him from opening it. The small piece of paper felt heavier than any business deal he had ever negotiated. For years, James had built a fortress around himself, one that shielded him from emotions he considered inconvenient. But now, that wall felt fragile. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally broke the seal and unfolded the letter. James, this isn't about you. It's about Ethan. I don't know what you expect from this, but I won't let you disrupt his life. If you truly want to be part of Ethan's world, you'll have to prove that you deserve it. We'll meet, but on my terms. Isabella. Relief flooded through him. She hadn't shut the door completely, but he also knew this wasn't forgiveness. It was a test, a chance he couldn't afford to waste. The meeting was set for the following evening. Isabella chose a small, quiet cafe far from the hustle and bustle of the city center. James arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in a casual blazer, his usual air of confidence tempered by the gravity of the situation. Isabella was already seated in the corner, her posture tense, her arms crossed. He hesitated for a moment before approaching the table. "Thank you for meeting me," he said quietly as he sat down. "I didn't do this for you," she replied, her tone cold but controlled. James nodded, accepting her anger. "I understand." He exhaled deeply, then got straight to the point. "What do I need to do to be part of his life?" Isabella leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "You don't just get to walk in and say you want to be a father, James. He doesn't even know you exist." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. "To him, you're no one." James flinched, the truth of her words hitting him harder than he expected. But he didn't interrupt. "If you really want this," Isabella continued, "you'll start at the bottom. No big declarations, no dramatic gestures. For now, you'll be introduced as a friend, someone who shares his interests. Ethan doesn't need to know who you are until I say he's ready." James swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I'll do whatever you say. I just want the chance to know him. And if you hurt him, if you make him doubt himself or feel abandoned," Isabella's voice dropped, her eyes narrowing. I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your life. I won't, James said, his voice steady. I promise. Isabella studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the man who had left her so easily. For the first time, she saw something different, something resembling sincerity. Fine, she said finally. You'll meet him this weekend. He loves science, so talk about that. But remember, James, this is your one and only chance. Saturday arrived, and Isabella found herself pacing nervously near the park entrance. Ethan was playing nearby with a small drone he had built from spare parts, his laughter carrying through the air. She watched him with a mixture of pride and dread, unsure how this day would unfold. James arrived a few minutes later, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater. He looked different, less polished, less intimidating, but there was a nervousness in his step that reminded Isabella of the weight of the moment. She took a deep breath and called out to her son, Ethan, I want you to meet a friend of mine. This is James. Ethan looked up, his bright green eyes, so much like James's, sparkling with curiosity. Hi, he said politely, clutching the drone in his hands. James knelt slightly to meet Ethan's eye level. Hi, Ethan. Your mom's told me a lot about you. I hear you're really into science. Ethan's face lit up. Yeah. Want to see my drone? James smiled. I'd love to. The two of them fell into an easy conversation, much to Isabella's surprise. Ethan eagerly explained how he had programmed the drone, pointing out the different parts and what they did. James listened intently, asking questions that showed genuine interest. You're really smart, James said after a while. I don't think I could have built something like this when I was your age. Ethan grinned, clearly pleased. My mom says I can be anything I want if I work hard. James's smile faltered slightly as he glanced at Isabella, who was watching from a nearby bench. There was a silent exchange between them, a mix of gratitude and guilt on his part, and guarded approval on hers. Later that evening, after they returned home, Isabella tucked Ethan into bed. He was still buzzing with excitement, talking about how much fun he'd had showing James's drone. He's cool, Ethan said sleepily. Do you think he'll come back? Isabella hesitated, smoothing his hair. Maybe. We'll see. After he fell asleep, she sat alone in the living room, staring at her phone. There was a message from James waiting for her. Thank you. Today meant more to me than I can say. I won't let you down. She sighed, conflicted. James had done well today, better than she expected, but a single afternoon couldn't erase years of absence. What would happen if Ethan grew attached, only for James to disappoint him again? She typed a short reply. Don't mess this up. That night, James lay awake in his apartment, replaying every moment of the day in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. He knew it would take time to prove himself to Isabella, time to earn Ethan's trust. But for once, he was willing to wait. He had been given a chance, however small, and he wasn't going to waste it. The days following their first meeting were a mix of nervous anticipation for James and cautious optimism for Isabella. Ethan had taken an immediate liking to James, something Isabella hadn't entirely expected. She watched from the sidelines as their interactions unfolded, her protective instincts on high alert, yet she couldn't deny that James was trying. And, to her surprise, he seemed to be genuine. James didn't push too hard. He followed Isabella's rules to the letter, showing up only when invited and keeping his role in Ethan's life as simple as possible. For now, he was just Mom's friend who likes science. But even in that small capacity, James found himself captivated by the boy's natural curiosity and boundless enthusiasm. One Saturday afternoon, they met again at the park. Ethan had brought along another one of his inventions, a small wind turbine he had built from recycled materials. James crouched next to him on the grass, listening intently as Ethan explained how it worked. So, the wind turns these blades, Ethan said, pointing to the tiny plastic propellers and it makes electricity. It's not a lot, but it could power a small light bulb if I hooked up right. That's incredible, James said, his admiration genuine. Did you come up with this all on your own? Ethan grinned. Kind of. I saw a video about renewable energy, and I wanted to try it myself. Mom helped me find the parts. James glanced at Isabella, who was sitting on a nearby bench, her arms crossed as she observed them. He gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, silently grateful for everything she had done for their son. You know, James said, turning back to Ethan, when I was your age, I used to take apart everything I could get my hands on, clocks, radios, even my dad's old record player. I wasn't as good at putting them back together, though. Ethan laughed. Did you get in trouble? Plenty, James admitted with a chuckle. But it taught me how things work. And now, I get to solve problems all the time in my job. Ethan's eyes lit up. What kind of problems? James paused, choosing his words carefully. Mostly business problems. I help companies figure out how to make things better, faster, smarter, more efficient. Kind of like what you do with your inventions. Ethan seemed impressed, nodding thoughtfully. That's cool. I want to invent something that helps people someday. Like a machine that cleans up trash in the ocean. James smiled, his chest tightening with pride. I think you could do that, Ethan. You're already on your way. Over the next few weeks, James continued to meet with Ethan regularly. They went to museums, worked on small projects together, and even attended a local science expo. Each time, James marveled at how easy it was to connect with Ethan. The boy was sharp, eager, and full of questions that often left James smiling in amusement or struggling to find answers. But it wasn't just Ethan who was changing. James found himself seeing the world differently, too. For years, his life had been defined by success, his career, his wealth, his image. But spending time with Ethan made him realize how empty those accomplishments had been without someone to share them with. One evening, as they were wrapping up a visit to the park, Ethan turned to James with a question that caught him completely off guard. James, how come you don't have kids of your own? James froze, his breath hitching. He glanced at Isabella, who had been walking a few steps behind them. Her expression turned tense, her eyes narrowing slightly in warning. James knelt down to Ethan's level, his voice calm but careful. That's a good question, Ethan. I guess I've just been waiting to meet someone as amazing as you to spend time with. Ethan grinned, satisfied with the answer, but Isabella's expression didn't soften. As they walked back to the car, she pulled James aside. You need to be careful, she said quietly, her tone firm. He's starting to trust you, and that's not something you can take lightly. James nodded, his jaw tightening. I know. I won't let him down. But as Ethan grew more comfortable with James, his curiosity about the man deepened. One night, after Isabella had tucked him into bed, Ethan asked her a question that made her heart skip a beat. Mom, do you think James would ever want to be my dad? Isabella froze, her hand still on his blanket. Why do you ask that, sweetheart? Ethan shrugged, looking thoughtful. He's really nice, and he likes the same things I do. I just thought maybe it would be cool. Isabella felt a lump form in her throat. She stroked his hair gently, choosing her words carefully. Ethan, families come in all shapes and sizes. You and I have been a family from the very beginning, and nothing will ever change that. Ethan nodded, but the hint of disappointment in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. That night, Isabella sat alone in the living room, her thoughts racing. James had been doing everything right, but the idea of telling Ethan the truth still terrified her. What if he felt betrayed? What if James couldn't live up to Ethan's expectations? She stared at her phone for a long time before typing a message to James. He's asking questions. We need to talk. James read the message late that night, sitting at his desk with a glass of scotch in hand. The words hit him harder than he expected. He knew this moment was coming. The moment when they would have to tell Ethan the truth. But no matter how much he prepared himself, the thought of seeing confusion or anger in Ethan's eyes was almost unbearable. For years, James had avoided responsibility, convincing himself that walking away had been the best choice for everyone. But now, faced with the chance to finally do right by his son, he felt the weight of his past decisions more heavily than ever. He pulled out a notebook and began writing a letter. It was something he'd started weeks ago but hadn't been able to finish, a letter to Ethan explaining everything. The mistakes, the regrets, the promises he was determined to keep. By the time he set down his pen, the sun was starting to rise. James folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a drawer. He wasn't ready to give it to Ethan yet, but he knew the day was coming. That weekend, Isabella invited James over for dinner. It was the first time he had been inside their home, and he couldn't help but notice how warm and inviting it was. Photos of Ethan lined the walls, and the smell of home-cooked food filled the air. As they sat around the table, laughing over Ethan's latest invention, a makeshift pulley system he had rigged in his bedroom, James felt something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. For the first time, he truly understood what he had been missing, and he was determined to prove, not just to Isabella, but to Ethan, that he deserved to be part of their family. The day Isabella had dreaded for years finally arrived. Ethan's curiosity about James had grown too strong to ignore, and it was clear he wasn't going to stop asking questions. After weeks of hesitation and late-night reflections, Isabella decided it was time to tell Ethan the truth. The decision wasn't easy, but she knew it was better for him to hear it from her than to stumble upon it accidentally. She called James the night before, her voice tense but resolute. "We're going to tell him tomorrow," she said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before James replied. "Are you sure he's ready for this?" "No," Isabella admitted. "But he deserves to know. And so do you." The next evening, James arrived at Isabella's house. For the first time, he noticed the nervous energy in the air. Isabella's usually calm demeanor was tinged with tension, and Ethan, though cheerful, seemed to sense that something was different. After dinner, Isabella called Ethan into the living room. James sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together as Isabella took a deep breath. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft but steady, "there's something important we need to talk about." Ethan tilted his head, his curious eyes darting between his mom and James. "What is it?" Isabella glanced at James, who gave her a small nod. She turned back to her son, kneeling in front of him, so they were at eye level. "You know how you've been asking me about your dad?" Ethan nodded, his brow furrowing slightly. "Well," Isabella continued, her hands gently resting on his, "the truth is, you do have a dad, and he's been closer to you than you realized." Ethan's confusion deepened, and he looked over at James. "What do you mean?" James leaned forward, his voice calm but thick with emotion. "Ethan, I'm your dad." For a moment, the room fell silent. Ethan stared at James, then back at his mom, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You're my dad?" "Yes," James said, his voice steady but trembling slightly. "I am." Ethan took a step back, his young mind struggling to process the revelation. "But why didn't you tell me before? Why weren't you here?" James felt his heart break at the pain in his son's voice. He opened his mouth to speak, but it was Isabella who answered first. "Ethan," she said gently, "your dad made some mistakes. A long time ago, he thought leaving was the best choice for everyone. But now, he realizes it wasn't. That's why he came back, to try to make things right." Ethan's lip quivered, and he looked directly at James. "You left us. You didn't want me." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He got down on one knee, meeting Ethan's tearful gaze. "No, Ethan, it wasn't that I didn't want you. I was scared. I made a terrible mistake, and I thought I was doing the right thing. But I was wrong. I've regretted it every day since, and I came back because I want to be in your life. If you'll let me." Ethan's small fists clenched at his sides. "You missed everything," he said, his voice trembling. My birthdays, my school projects, everything. James nodded, his own eyes glistening with tears. I know, and I can't change that. But if you give me the chance, I promise I'll be here for everything from now on. I'll never leave you again. Ethan's gaze flickered to his mom, searching for reassurance. Isabella's eyes were filled with tears, but she gave him a small nod. It's okay to feel angry, sweetheart, she said softly. You don't have to decide how you feel right now. Take your time. For a long moment, Ethan was silent, his young mind racing. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to think about it. James nodded, respecting his son's honesty. I understand, he said. Take all the time you need. I'll be here whenever you're ready. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Isabella and James sat together in the living room. The tension between them had softened, replaced by an unspoken understanding. You handled that better than I expected, Isabella admitted. James let out a quiet laugh, running a hand through his hair. I don't think there's a manual for this kind of thing, but thank you for letting me be there. Isabella nodded, her gaze distant. He's a good kid. He'll need time. But I think he'll come around. I'll wait as long as it takes, James said firmly. I'm not going anywhere. Over the following days, James kept his distance, allowing Ethan the space he needed. Isabella, meanwhile, continued to reassure her son, reminding him that it was okay to feel whatever he was feeling. One afternoon, as James sat at his desk at work, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Isabella. Ethan wants to see you. Can you come over tonight? His heart leaped, and he replied immediately. I'll be there. That evening, James arrived at Isabella's house, nervous but hopeful. Ethan was waiting for him in the living room, holding one of his inventions, a small robot he had been working on. Hi, Ethan said quietly as James entered. Hi, buddy, James replied, his voice soft. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then held out the robot. Do you want to help me finish this? It's almost done, but I can't get the wires to stay in place. James felt his throat tighten, but he managed a smile. I'd love to. They spent the next hour working on the robot together, the tension gradually easing as they shared laughs and ideas. By the time the robot was complete, Ethan was grinning from ear to ear. Thanks, he said, looking up at James. James met his son's gaze, his voice steady but full of emotion. Thank you for letting me be here, Ethan. It means everything to me. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. Maybe you can come back again, if you want. James's heart swelled. I'd like that. A lot. That night, as James drove home, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was finally on the right path. And in Ethan's room, as the boy drifted off to sleep, he clutched the finished robot in his hands, a small smile on his face. For the first time, he felt like his family was whole. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.